Okay, so let's take a little bit of a closer look at the four states of the Middle East by our narrow definition: Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Iraq. Just a few geographic facts. But first, it's good to point out that this entire region was once part of the Ottoman Empire, an empire ruled by Muslims, but not Arabs. It was centered on Turkey, modern-day Turkey, but the region of Anatolia, with its capital in Istanbul. So the Ottoman Empire existed for several centuries, but started to go into decline towards the end of the 1800s and was defeated altogether at during World War I by the European powers, France and Britain. So during that time, there was Arab nationalism was on the rise. So when it was still the Ottoman Empire, you had people who wanted Arabs from this region, right? It's mostly Arab in the Middle East, wanting to assert their independence from the Ottoman Empire, and then later in the 1920s, after World War I, wanting to assert their independence especially from the French and the British to a degree. Meanwhile, the French were favoring the Christian Arabs in what would become the country, the state of Lebanon. That was part of the French policy, was to favor the Maronite Christians and then to create the boundaries of the modern state of Lebanon such that these Maronite Christians had a majority within that state for a while. So today, for example, you have Syrian, Lebanese Americans, Arab Americans, Americans of Arabic descent. Here's Marlo Thomas, the actress, and Ralph Nader, the politician and consumer advocate. Also various residents right here in La Crosse, Wisconsin. So these people, Americans of Syrian Lebanese descent, consider themselves equally Lebanese and Syrian, and they tend to have their roots in this Maronite Christian community. Syria is a critical region for many reasons. It's going from west to east. It's a kind of a hinge, a connection point between the Mediterranean Sea and lands further east, like the Persian Gulf region. And then also it's squeezed between Turkey or Anatolia to the north and the Arabian Peninsula to its south. Most people in Syria live towards the Mediterranean coast in the west, where there's higher rainfall, but also in other areas, the southwest, the Druze region, as well as the northernmost part near the Turkish border and over towards the Kurdish-speaking region into northern Iraq. That area has moderate rainfall that sort of comes and goes. Some years are wetter than others. Moving on to Lebanon. Lebanon, the modern state, enjoyed a kind of a European-style prosperity throughout the first part of the 20th century. Beirut was known as the Paris of the Levant. But in the 1970s and into the 80s, it's factionalism amongst the different groups, mainly on religious, ethno-religious lines, caused a lot of violence, and also the neighboring state of Israel was problematic in that Israel wanted to maintain its security along its northern border with Lebanon. And in fact, if we take a closer look at the region where Syria and Israel and Lebanon all come together, we can see it's very complicated geographically and in terms of its political geography too, right? So you have places like the Golan Heights, where both Israel, Syria, and Lebanon all claim that strategically important area, but it's currently occupied by the state of Israel, which has the superior military force in this region, although Syria's military force is quite formidable as well. Let you read that. Reminder. Then moving on to Jordan, we won't talk about it too much. It's very much a modern invention, in this case mainly by the British in the years just before World War II. Most people there consider themselves Palestinians, that is to say Arabic Muslims from the Levant, this part of the Middle East. Many of them have an origin further west across the Dead Sea and across the Jordan River in what's now Israel, including the occupied the area called the West Bank, which has been occupied by the state of Israel for several decades. Finally, Iraq. If we move further to the east, Iraq, which didn't exist at all as a state until the 20th century either. Before that, it was just a series of Ottoman provinces, Baghdad, Mosul, within the area of Mesopotamia. Today's Iraq is mostly Mesopotamia, but also includes parts of nearby mountain and desert regions. So the modern state of Iraq, centered on the capital city of ancient, glorious, very culturally significant city of Baghdad, but also includes other areas like Al-Anbar province, which is where the Sunni minority has its strongest presence. So Saddam Hussein's family has its origins there, for example, as well as the upper Mesopotamian region, the upper Tigris Valley, which is a hilly area occupied mostly by ethnic Kurds, right? The Kurdish people speaking an Indo-European language, nothing to do with Arabic. They are Muslim, but they're not Arabic. So what language family is Kurdish in? Indo-European, right. Where the Tigris and Euphrates flow into the Persian Gulf, you have the Shat al-Arab region. There are large oil fields in this area, as you know from the Persian Gulf that you learned about in a previous module. But it's also the home to a very unusual ethnic group, the Marsh Arabs, who almost went extinct because their marshes were systematically drained and destroyed, but they've managed to hold on, and now the marshes in this region and the culture are starting to make a comeback. Today there are 34 million people in Iraq. So it's sort of medium-large for a state in this region.